Good evening and welcome to Artist Talk. I'm Doug Shear, President. Tonight's Zoom features the historic Woodstock collection and its creator, Arthur A. Anderson, in dialogue with Woodstock historian Tom Wolfe. This program is the next to last of our 50th anniversary spring season. It is an ATOA copyright and will appear on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. Next week is an open screening featuring street artists and muralists. If you'd like to join that event as a presenter, simply send me an email. That's Doug Shear, DOUGSHEER, @gmail.com. And do so by Sunday evening, May 12th. After May 12th, after the next panel, we will have our 50th anniversary gala celebration, which we're holding at the Soho Photo Gallery, 15 White Street in Tribeca in Manhattan. We're honoring Liza Kerwin, Deputy Director Emerita of Archives of American Art of the Smithsonian Institution, and Gail Levin, Distinguished Professor at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. Both will be receiving Lifetime Achievement Awards. There's still some tickets available, and of course, more details can be found at www.atoanyc.org. We're also featuring an online art auction on BidSquare, and you may bid beginning in about a week from now until that closes on Thursday, May 30th at 12 noon. There are already more than 90 lots consigned, with works from a few $100s to tens of thousands of dollars. There's something in there for everyone and everyone's taste. You may still consign work if you wish. Again, just contact me, or in fact, if you go to the website, you'll see a donate here. Just click on that button. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. All proceeds are going to go to both our ongoing operations and the production of a half-century book of synopses of over 100 panels and dialogues that will be due out in 2025. Please hold your questions or comments until the last 15 or 20 minutes, or insert them in the chat if you wish, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Wolfe, who will in turn introduce Arthur A. Anderson. Tom.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. It's nice to see everybody, and I'm pleased to introduce Arthur Anderson, who many of you know as a collector of art specializing on the Woodstock colony. And after much research that I was partially witness to, he decided to give it away, and the research was where to give it. He spoke to many different institutions and decided to give it to the State Museum of New York in Albany, which seems to have been a very good decision. And that's where it resides now, in honor of his generous donation of 1,200 Woodstock objects made by a panoply of Woodstock artists. They did an exhibition, and then they subsequently, curated by Karen Quinn, they subsequently did a second exhibition at the Dorsey Museum, and then they've just published a book of essays that just came out by a number of scholars, including myself and Bruce Weber, who's here tonight, Karen Quinn, about aspects of the history of the Woodstock colony. So he's a man of great cultivation and great generosity, and I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Before you do, Tom, and before I commit an egregious faux pas, a very brief bio of Tom Wolfe, if you humor me there. Forgive me. Tom Wolfe is Professor Emeritus of Art and Visual Culture at Bard College. His primary areas of research are the history of the Woodstock, New York art colony and Asian American art. Recent publications have included The Tip of the Iceberg, Early Asian American Artists in New York in Asian American Art, A History. Stanford University Press, 2008. The Artistic Journey of Yuso Kuniyoshi, Smithsonian American Art Museum 2015, Centennial of the Woodstock Artists Association, the Woodstock Artists Association 2019, Doris Lee and Woodstock in Simple Pleasures, The Art of Doris Lee, Weatherspoon Art Museum 2020, Global Connections, the Samuel Dorsky Museum 2024. And now over to Arthur A. Anderson.
Well, thank you, Doug. It's really an honor to be here, this esteemed organization, and having got to work with Doug, Miriam, and of course, Tom Wolfe. And what I'm going to do is, Doug mentioned this incredible book that's available at Amazon now, coming, or I think it is, that's coming out about the historic Woodstock Art Colony. And not only is there a book, there is now a 6-minute short film. And we just finished the short film last night. Stephen Blauweiss is the producer. And the participants are Karen Quinn and myself. And we're going to start off by showing that, if we could, please, just to give context to what Tom and I are going to be talking about.
Audio.
Yeah, there is audio. The historic Woodstock Art Colony, founded in 1902, is unique among all American and French art colonies. It was intentionally founded as a year-round, full-time art colony by 4 diverse artists. Ralph Whitehead, an English philanthropist who studied at Oxford with John Ruskin, who was the utopian writer, philosopher, and art critic of the day, and an anti-capitalist. Jane Bird McCall from Philadelphia, who studied art history with John Ruskin in Paris and married Ralph Whitehead. Hervey White, the writer from Iowa who attended Harvard and then worked at Jane Addams' Solomon House in Chicago. And Bolton Brown, the artist and accomplished mountaineer from upstate New York who founded the art department at Stanford University. Woodstock began as a year-round arts colony in 1902 and in due course became known throughout America as a community of all the arts. Early hallmarks of the colony were the Maverick Costume, Art, and Music Festival in 1916, the chamber music series known worldwide and is now over 100 years old, and in 1932 the August Full Moon Festival, said to be the Catskills' wildest party. This led to Bob Dylan and the band living and recording in Woodstock along with Janis Joplin and others, and this was before the iconic 1969 Peace and Love Festival.
Woodstock itself has been an artist community since 1902, a very important one and still very much alive today. But it doesn't adhere to any one style. Artists who worked in Woodstock worked in all styles, worked in all media, and certainly contributed to a very vibrant artistic community, both in the past and right now.
Of the 180 artists in the collection, none was born in Woodstock, and they were born in 33 states and in 19 foreign countries. So here we have an artist colony, and in close proximity to New York City. When Birdcliff came, there were artists living in Birdcliff, but they were quite separated from the village. What made the big difference was the Art Students League coming to town in the summer of 1906. That shocked the locals. These were young bohemian artists, and they were doing all kinds of things. The Wetero map shows that in 1925, there were over 100 houses in Woodstock occupied by artists. Whereas in 1900, before the founding of Birdcliff, there were no artists living there. When you look at all the artists, you can see that George Bellows, Eugene Spiker, and Charles Rosen lived in a very small, tight community. This was not all roses for the artists. They had different political views at times. They had very different views on arts. There were the traditionalists, like Burge Harrison. Sometimes they got very confrontational with the modernists. When it came to art, they did not pull any punches about which art was better or the right one, but they were still friends. They did not destroy friendships over that, although some artists became very reclusive and did their own thing without much involvement in the community.
One of the most prominent artists who came to Woodstock was George Bellows. He came at the invitation of Eugene Spiker, and their artistic friends created their own individual community. The wide range of artists associated with Bellows in Woodstock was important as another magnet for the community.
Eugene Spiker was America's most prominent portrait painter, and he did this one of a local girl in Saugerties. It was deaccessioned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was the fortunate one who bought it at auction. Bellows and Spiker were artist brothers. They're unrelated, but they were artist brothers. Another aspect of community in the Woodstock colony is the extent to which Bellows, in particular, did caricatures of their fellow artists and townspeople. There's a lithograph in the collection done by Pele de Lappe of two couples, the Blanches, Mr. and Mrs., and the Lees, Mr. and Mrs. And eventually, Mrs. Lee left Mr. Lee and became the wife of Mr. Blanche. You can see Arnold Blanche giving a very strong look directly to the eye of Mrs. Lee. Woodstock resident Peggy Bacon was a student of George Bellows at the Art Students League in New York.
This print by Peggy Bacon of a clam bake at Woodstock gives a wonderful sense of community of both the artists, and people are recognizable in this image, and include Peggy Bacon herself as she leans down to feed a cat some of the clams. One of my favorite comparisons is of two images he made of the artist John Carroll. One is very serious looking lithograph where he is very romantically handsome, and the other is a caricature which is kind of goofy looking and quite endearing. It gives you two sides of not only John Carroll, but two sides of George Bellows.
This work by Julio Di Diego is a painting with 14 panels. It's surrealistic, which is one of the reasons I love it. And the panels, although similar, are also so different.
This Doing Woodard nude is quite unusual for Woodstock artists in terms of the fact that it is a nude, a model, a local person, painted outdoors. Bolton Brown, who was one of the founders of Birdcliff, went on to become one of the most important lithographers in the United States. He's often referred to as the father of American lithography. And he not only made his own lithographs, he printed for other artists, including George Bellows and many, many others.
And this one was printed by Bolton Brown for Rockwell Kent. The plan is to turn this short into a feature documentary. Meanwhile, SUNY Press has published a book available on Amazon entitled The Historic Woodstock Art Colony.
Okay, well, thank you for that. That was a good overview. And was everything there out of the Arthur Anderson collection that we saw?
Yes.
Yeah, really substantial collection. And now, am I emceeing this? It's like,
Well, I believe you wanted to have Arthur go ahead and show his slides
right.
at this point.
Okay, now let's see. I'm going to do an audio and refer to the slides from numbers 1 through 8. So if this is a question, procedure. If I begin the audio, can I say slide 1 when I'm ready for that one, and slide 2 when I'm ready for that one? How's that going to work for our person in charge of that?
Yeah, that's fine. You can just tell me when to skip to the next slide.
That's great. That's great. So I won't look at any slides now, just do a little intro, and then I'll get on to mentioning the slides. I'm really going to first talk about my collecting adventure. And it began, in fact, you can keep up slide number 1, the lady on the right, the lady with the red lips. Put away the other one for now. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
Just the lady with the red lips.
on the right, my face in the screen. Norbert Hiermann. This is the first painting I ever bought in my life. I was a collector of minerals and stamps before this, as a kid. Okay, so I'll begin. The lady with the red lips on the right of my screen, that's the door that opened to my collecting adventure when I fell in love with her, the lady with the red lips, in a gallery in Socrates in 1990. So I bought her. I emptied my bank account, actually. It was financially imprudent for me to do so as I woke up the next morning, so I brought her back to turn her back in.
What a story.
Are we okay there?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm still talking about her. I tried to return the next morning. Of course, the gallery would not take it back, and I owned the painting. Upon questioning the gallery owner, I was told the artist who did this was Norbert Hiermann, and he was a member of George Bellows' Woodstock Artist Circle, and they played on the Woodstock softball team together. The connection in Woodstock of Hiermann, the painter of the painting I just bought, to George Bellows, motivated me to do some research and helped me ultimately justify my purchase to my family. I was under a lot of pressure that I had done that. And the lady with red lips has actually become, over time, one of the most appreciated works of art in the New York State Museum collection. It didn't begin as a legacy collection at all. I really bought this painting that I liked, but I began to go to art auctions in the museum area. And as things came up for auction and no one was interested in them, I said, this is a shame if someone's not here to buy them. It didn't have to be me, but it had to be someone. Otherwise, you lose them. You don't know where they go, and it's hard to track them down. So given Herbert Norman was a buddy of George Bellows, my first area of collecting was George Bellows and his Woodstock Circle. And I did this around 1990 to 2000, 2002. Notwithstanding, Bellows had died young at age 42 in 1925, and I didn't know what other works I would find. I only focused on drawings. It was beyond my financial means to own his paintings, but there were a lot of drawings around and not very much appreciated at the time. I was given a fortuitous introduction to Jean Bellows Booth, Bellows' youngest daughter. She lived in Southern California by this time. And I had the good fortune to be doing business in Southern California. And whenever I went out there, I visited her. And she was a very gracious, lovely lady. And she made the family archives available to me and made introductions for me to her Woodstock friends. Now, a work in, and we can keep up the drawing on the left. But the drawing on the left has particular meaning to me, not only because it's by George Bellows, but it's a drawing of his daughter, Jean, as a baby, drawn by her father, initialed by her father, and given to her by her father, and eventually it came into my possession from her. So that has a particular meaning for me. Now, let's see, let me give you a sidebar about Eugene Spiker and George Bellows. Bellows, you know the name of course. Spiker, you probably do not, or you may, if you follow the Woodstock art colony history. They were not only artist brothers, they were fellow athletes. They were both very good athletes, really of semi-pro quality. Bellows born in Columbus, Ohio, and Spiker born in Albany, New York. They were also favorite students of Robert Henry, kind of the esteemed art teacher, even to this day, because his book, the 1923 The Art Spirit, still sells today on Amazon. Thereafter, Spiker and Bellows were forever joined at the hip. And here they are, and this is image 3 coming up. And here they are on one of their Woodstock art expeditions, decked out in Bellows' car. So this is what they go out into the hustings to do landscapes, basically. And the notations there are by Bellows. There could well be a misspelling because he was not a good speller. And this is from the Henry collection at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book Library, and is on a letter that Bellows wrote to Henry. We can go to image 3, please. Next image. Yes, on the left. This is a favorite of mine for a number of reasons. It's a portrait of Jean Bellows, painted by Jean Spiker, her namesake. It's Bellows' youngest daughter, named after Jean Spiker. And it was done not many months after Bellows died so quick in 1925. And it's unlike any other Spiker painting I've seen. It's very rough brush strokes, and it's not finished at all like most Spiker paintings are. And I never knew why that would be, except when I was with Jean Bellows one time. Oh, she said, oh yeah, I remember that. Now, Spiker usually paid his models 50 cents an hour to sit. He didn't pay me anything. And I was getting there very, antsy, and I just wanted to get out of there. And so he finished it off very quickly. It's a favorite painting of mine. It's the same year, 1925, an already scheduled solo retrospective of Bellows was planned at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They had acquired their first painting by Bellows in 1911, when he was about around 29 years old, and was soon to become one of the most famous artists in America. At about the same time, or actually a little bit after, Spiker was becoming one of America's most famous portrait painters. And we've seen the one of her earlier, of Jean Bellows, drawn by her father. That's in the collection. We can go to the next one. Next image. A thing that appeals to me in building the collection is kind of, I don't know how unusual it is, but it's a characteristic of the historic Woodstock art colony at the time, in the 30s, 40s, 20s, up to pretty much Second World War, is their friendships had humor. And this was expressed in caricatures of the artists themselves. They weren't embarrassed to make themselves look rather silly, but also of other artists. And that indicates to me strong friendship, as does this one by Bellows, and this would be image 4. I can describe it to you. It's a so-called poker sketch. A lot of these caricatures by Bellows were done at the artist poker parties. And the one of Spiker, I wish I had put a photograph of Spiker on it because it really makes good humor out of some of Spiker's facial characteristics. Now, keep this one here if you would, please. This is image 5, at least on my list. The Bellows and the Spikers as couples really were extended family. The Henrys were part of it, the Leon Crowes were part of that, but it really was about the Spikers and Bellows living next door to each other in Woodstock for, 4 or 5 months of the year. And Spiker eventually encouraged the Bellows to build a house in Woodstock next door to his. Another feature that appeals to me of the Woodstock County friendships is the tradition of one artist gifting and annotating a work of his or her art to a fellow artist, another Woodstock artist. We can go to image 6, if you would, please. There we go. This one is done by the artist Julio Di Diego, born in Spain, spent much of his life in Woodstock, and is a gift to and celebrates the 1948 solo exhibition by Kuniyoshi at the Whitney Museum, which was the Whitney's first solo exhibition ever of a living artist. And you can see, I don't know if you can really read it, but you can see down below Julio's, it's called Woodstock Bugs. Down below you can see Julio reaching out to Kuniyoshi. And in the Julio Di Diego archives is a letter from Kuniyoshi to Julio thanking him for giving this to him. Now, moving on, and I hope how am I on time, Doug?
Impeccable.
Impeccable, okay. Okay, I like to be impeccable if that's possible. Okay, moving on, I'm going to give a little background on context, how this collection kind of came together. So I think we already heard from the movie that the county was founded in 1902 as birthplace by 4 diverse American artists. It is said by me that it was America's first intentionally founded, personally funded year-round arts colony. In 1902, when they first, the founders discovered the land, it was really a half a dozen or so farms, making about maybe 1,500 or more acres. Woodstock then was a small rural agricultural village located in the high Catskill Mountains, far enough away from, but not too far from New York City. By 1926, this is what this is the iconic Whitero map. It elegantly marks all the houses, at least known to the artist couple that did this, where artists occupied them. And if you want to go back and look at this on YouTube, it'll take you maybe an hour to work your way through it, and you have to care to count houses because they're kind of, a lot of them are there, but I lost count when I reached 100. I stopped counting, I should say. Now, of the 180 or so artists in the collection of 1,500 works, none was born in Woodstock. They were born in 33 states and 19 countries. And nearly all of the artists in the collection, that would be about 40%, of the 180 so, who died after the Woodstock Artist Cemetery was founded in 1934, are interred in the Artist Cemetery. So they were born in Woodstock, but they ended up there. Now, important to the colony's growth during its 3 years was the Art Students League of New York, which moved its summer school from Old Lyme, Connecticut, to Woodstock in 1906. This brought in a lot of students, as we saw in a couple of slides of the film. Other keys to growth were the founding of the Maverick Colony in 1906 by one of the Berkeley Colony's founders, Herbie White. Then the Maverick Concert Series was founded in 1916, and that is still thriving today. It's a chamber music series venue. The Woodstock Arts Association was founded in around 1920. There were wild parties of the August Full Moon Festival that began in 1932, and we saw a couple of slides on that. And Bob Dylan and the band lived and recorded in Woodstock before the 1969 iconic Woodstock Peace and Love Festival in downstate Bethel. And the list goes on. I'm going to stop that part of it here.
Actually, Arthur, I should say that within the next 2 minutes, I'd like you to pass the baton to Tom.
Great, thanks for that. I appreciate it.
Okay.
So what I'll do just in my final remarks is say a legacy art collection like this, and by that I mean a collection that you sometime during the collecting process wanted to reside in a museum, right, as one collection rather than being dispersed by sale. It's really not a one-man show at all, or one-woman show. It's an endeavor of kindred spirits with very diverse contributions. And among my kindred spirits, some living, some deceased, are the following: art historians Tram Combs, Bruce Weber, and Tom Wolfe; art gallerists Tom Fletcher, Jim Cox, and Tom French; art conservators St. Julian Fishburne and Mike Denson; Karen Quinn, Jennifer Lemack, and Mark Shamming of the New York State Museum; Neil Tragan of the originating director of the Dorsey Museum; my parents, Alvin A. and Mildred Jane Anderson; my right hand, Eric Lack; my mate and also art historian, Caroline Dixwell Cabinet; and the filmmaker for the film you saw, Stephen Blauweiss of Blauweiss Media. So thanks very much for hanging in here with this recitation, and thanks for attending and being interested in the Woodstock Art Colony. That's it. Thank you.
And now, Tom Wolfe.
Okay, hello, everybody, and thank you, Arthur, for everything. It was suggested that I run through my little essay for this catalog, which was about women in the early years of the Woodstock Art Colony, women artists, which I'm going to do. And like any rich topics led to more research, so I'm going to go on into things that interested me in that I've developed further, and kind of speed through a lot of stuff, which I could stop at any time. But I'm going to share my screen, I hope. This is always embarrassing because my screen is such chaos. But here we go. Covering some ground that Arthur already covered. You can see this okay? Everybody can see the presentation?
Yes, sir.
Ralph Whitehead, who founded the Birdcliff Colony with 3 collaborators, Hervey White, Bolton Brown, who we quickly heard about, and his wife, Jane Whitehead. So from my research about Birdcliff and the early years of the art colony, and actually the ongoing history of the art colony, I've found that it's been a nurturing place for women artists, unlike many other places in the United States. And Whitehead, who may have been a bit of a womanizer, was part of that because he was supportive of women and women artists, as I will get into. And Hervey White and Whitehead were probably the main driving forces. Well, all four of them were, but they definitely were formative, these two. And they were introduced to each other by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the famous first generation feminist who was at Hull House in Chicago and knew both Whitehead and White and introduced them to each other there. And then they bonded and became collaborators with Whitehead's wife and Bolton Brown in founding the Birdcliff Arts and Crafts Colony. So my research about this got me very interested in Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and I think she's a formative and influential figure in the history of the Woodstock Art Colony, as I'm going to get into in the next few minutes. So there's Bolton Brown. This photograph, and the photograph of Jane Bird McCall Whitehead are all taken by Eva Watson Schutze, who is a woman photographer. She was a collaborator with the famous Alfred Stieglitz until she got married to Martin Schutze, who was teaching at the University of Chicago and left New York to with Schutze in Chicago, except they spent long summers for many years in Woodstock, where she became the primary photographer of the early years, working in a pictorialist style of deliberate, soft-focused, delicately toned photographs. So Jane McCall Whitehead was an artist. She studied with John Ruskin for a while in London, the influential founder of the arts and crafts movement. And from him, she and Whitehead studied with Ruskin as well, and they picked up his principles, which is to base everything on nature, study nature, as she's doing in this watercolor, and then incorporate that into art and the decorative arts. She worked with her husband on ceramics, the Birdcliff ceramics, of which this is an example. They also worked with weaving, because parts of the arts and crafts movement was to respect crafts as much as the fine arts. So they supported that. The Birdcliff colony invited artists to the colony. As you probably know, he built close to 30 buildings with Bolton Brown assisting him, and gave scholarships to young artists who came up there. One of the most prominent was Zulma Steele, one of the women artists in the early Birdcliff colony, which is my focus in my essay. She lived in a Birdcliff house that's still there called Angelus, with her roommate Edna Walker, who was also an artist, both of them students of Arthur Wesley Dow, who recommended them there. This is a photograph of the two of them there. And she was very active in designing for the furniture that was produced by the early Birdcliff colony. This is a cabinet that's in the Los Angeles Museum of Art, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where she did a lot of the design. And again, based on nature, then incorporated the furniture, emphasizing the unpainted wood grain as another aspect of respect for nature. Here's another example of her work, where she designed this cabinet and the floral decoration. And here's another example, this lily blanket chest, which some of you may know is in the Museum of the American Arts and Crafts Movement in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is a fairly new museum. It's only 2 years old, and it has accumulated the most extensive collection of Birdcliff furniture of any other collection. So if you're interested in Birdcliff and arts and crafts, I recommend you go and check it out. Anyhow, this has her floral design in the four corners.
Go with Sylvia.
Based on a print. Is somebody asking a question or not muted? Based on a beautiful print like this, which would have been preceded by drawing of the flower itself, turned into a print, and then kind of formalized into the carving for the chest. This is a painting of her at the time by Zulma Steele. Her ambitions were always to be a painter, which she did in her later career. I singled this out because it's a fairly rare example of her early work. It's around 1904, and because what it shows is a kind of impressionist landscape with one man and three women, and that kind of is symbolic of the prevalence of women artists in the Birdcliff colony. And then she went on to paint majestic landscapes like this of the Oshokan Reservoir. This is a late self-portrait, one of the two known self-portraits by her. And this is back to Angelus, the house at Birdcliff, inhabited by her and her friend and collaborator, Edna Walker, for many years. Edna Walker we know less about her because Zulma Steele stayed in Woodstock and Edna Walker left and went to Europe. But this cabinet that is almost always on view in the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art as one of their prime Birdcliff artifacts was designed by Edna Walker. And the Met also has, again, it incorporates, for one thing, stained wood. You don't cover up the wood grain, which is part of nature, and you put in a kind of asymmetrical decorative relief ornament based on natural forms, which began with drawings. This is also in the Met as a companion to that chest. I took this photograph because they showed it a while ago, and it's under glass, so it's got some reflection on it, which was unavoidable. But anyhow, this is one of the drawings that then was carved into the ornament for this classic Birdcliff cabinet by Edna Walker. Eva Watson-Schutze, I mentioned already. And this is another one of her photographs of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who I'm going to return to and devote a fair amount of time to because she's fascinating. In Chicago, Eva Watson-Schutze was part of an prominent intellectual circle. This is her photograph, one of her photographs of the great philosopher John Dewey, who also came and spent time at Birdcliff. And then she did many tonalist, delicately toned photographs like this, often of mothers and children. This is Bolton Brown's wife and one of their children. And this is one of her photographs of her husband, probably in the forests of Birdcliff, playing his violin and kind of communing with nature, again, in a delicately toned photograph. Beyond Birdcliff, other women artists were drawn to Woodstock, but I should mention that other women who were active parts of the Birdcliff colony included Marie Little, who was a weaver. Again, the crafts were highly respected. Bertha Thompson, who was a metal worker. Edith Penman and Elizabeth Hardenberg, who were a team who made ceramics, arts and crafts ceramics. All of those women were encouraged by Whitehead to live there, and often he gave them living quarters and helped with their expenses. So it was a colony where there were a lot of women artists. I have a quote from a little later, 1910, from a letter from Jane Whitehead about Birdcliff. She says, "This place has improved, but there is a lack of men as usual. Stevens and the two engineers are good, but the 30 women want some more and some older men." So, and I think this tradition of creative, independent women continued in Woodstock down through today. Anyhow, Abyssinia St. Leger Eberly was an active sculptor whose work is very sought after these days. This is one of her most famous pieces because it's political and aggressively feminist. The White Slave, where we have an idealized young woman seemingly being auctioned off by this rather brutish looking and caricatured man. She showed this in an important benefit exhibition in support of the suffragist movement that Zulma Steele, among other Woodstock women, also showed in. Well, there's a photograph of her at work. This is this wonderful sculpture of her, of the girls skating. She spent time on the Lower East Side and took immigrant children as a subject for a lot of her works. This is now on view in the Metropolitan Museum in the American Wing. As I said, her work is very sought after now, and it's a wonderfully animated and joyous sculpture. again, mother and children. The suffragists, one of their arguments, political arguments for getting women to vote was, you trust us to take care of your children, you should trust us to vote. So in this period, there were a lot of women doing a lot of mother and children subjects, in part with that political motive behind it. And this is a lovely plaque, a metal plaque with a mermaid, a more fanciful subject than usual for her, kind of Art Nouveau, that Arthur is part of the Arthur Anderson collection of the State Museum of New York. And this is one that we know is a Woodstock subject, the Windy Doorstep. Again, a woman at work. Most of these are maybe 12 to 15 inches high. They're modest sized. There's another view of it. I mean, she really knew how to work three-dimensionally in terms of sculpture. And doing woodward is not part of Birdcliff, though she was part of the crowd around it, but she's another fascinating woman artist in Woodstock in the early years of the colony. Bruce Weber recently wrote an informative profile of her on his Learning Woodstock Art Colony blog that you can check out online. And she did a very loaded thing, living in Woodstock with her woman partner. She started a group called the Blue Dome Fraternity. This is fellowship. This is an ad for it, where she had men and women artists who hired a model to pose nude in the landscape and go out and paint the model. Usually a woman. I'm not aware of any male models, but and that was a pretty radical thing to do at this point. As I'll be talking about, that's going to be one of my themes this evening, is the fact that in this period, well, for one thing, if you know Linda Nochlund's famous essay, an influential essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? One of our arguments for that is that women artists were held back in the 19th century because it was considered improper for them to draw from nude models. At the same time that drawing from the nude models was one of the essential things you had to do to make yourself a serious artist. So doing woodward, by taking people out in the countryside and making this team of people who are drawing from the nude in the countryside, was doing a pretty radical thing, especially since the artists were both male and female. What happened as we move into the 20th century, we start getting opportunities for women to work from the model, but in gender segregated classes. You'd have women drawing classes with a nude model, and you'd have men drawing classes with a nude model. In fact, I'm fascinated by that Art Students League photograph that was an Arthur's film where it looked like both genders drawing from the nude. I wonder what the date of that photograph was. But anyhow, doing woodward, eventually moved with her partner to Florida, and then they had a studio fire and a lot of her work was destroyed. So her work is pretty rare, but this is an example of an extant piece of the nude in nature. This is a little better color. It was hard to photograph. And here's another one that is, I know only from a reproduction. And here's another one that we saw already because it's in Arthur Anderson's collection that was given to the State Museum of New York. I think is a very significant donation, this specific work, in terms of the sexual mores of the time and how they intersected with painting practices. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman, I've spent a lot of time on. She's a major figure, and there's a tremendous amount of literature about her. So influential. You may know her as the author of the famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a feminist classic. There she is again in Eva Watson Schutz's photograph. She was married to a painter and for a short period of time, Charles Walter Stetson, and that's kind of the focus of my some of my recent research. I'm really interested in what happened between the two of them, especially since at that time, the young Charlotte Perkins Gilman had aspirations to be an artist herself. She was in the first class of the new Rhode Island School of Design. They were both in Rhode Island, and that's where she met Charles Walter Stetson, who was a struggling artist herself. And they had a short marriage of 2 or 3 years, about which she was very conflicted, and then she left. And that was the inspiration for the classic story, The Yellow Wallpaper, about a woman who is depressed, and so her husband and her doctor decide to give her a cure that was popular, somewhat popular at the time, which was to put her in a room and deprive her of all intellectual stimulation so she could calm down. So she wasn't allowed to read, she wasn't allowed to draw, she wasn't allowed to write. And that's actually one of the things they tried to do with Charlotte Perkins Gilman when she was getting really depressed about her marriage, which almost drove her crazy. And she finally broke away from it. And that became the origins of this famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. But for a while, they were somewhat happy together. That's one of there's a lot of correspondence. These are late Victorian people. They're writing all the time. They're saving what they write. I've been through a lot of it, and her ambivalence is manifest and genuine. I mean, he wasn't the bad guy, and they actually had a child, and they collaborated in raising her. The subsequent history is she left. She would eventually marry her cousin and live with him happily. And Charles Walter Stetson married her best friend, but it seems to have been a compatible thing. And Charles Walter Stetson and Grace Channing pretty much raised their daughter with Charlotte Perkins Gilman playing some role. Before that, though, they were these two aspiring artists, recently married, who did things like this, which is a collaboration. It's like the surrealist game where someone starts a drawing and folds it over, and then the next person develops the drawing more. You can see this is Charles Walter Stetson. This is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. They folded it in the middle. She added the barrel, and then they called it Hamlet. So there's a group of those in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, which houses a lot of Stetson and Gilman's stuff. And I got really interested in her early career as an artist, where partially she made money by doing trading cards for a soap company in Rhode Island. So I've collected some of those. There's a little bit of literature on them. I think it really reflects her mentality at the time. And my thesis about her marriage to Stetson is she was truly ambivalent about it, and he wasn't the bad guy. In fact, after they split up, when the news she was well known, and the newspapers said, "Look at this feminist. She's leaving her child and husband." He defended her in the press. He said she had good reasons. She's a good person. But before that, I have a bunch of quotes from her where, writing to him, she questioned whether I am most a woman or Charlotte A. Perkins. So being a woman would be a wife and a traditional Victorian woman. Being Charlotte Perkins would be being an independent woman. She would refer to herself as I, yet not I, talk about her two-faced nature and the other me, because she was genuinely conflicted. And Stetson felt that if they finally got married, that would make her happier. Turns out he was wrong. Anyhow, in these trading cards, I think there's a really interesting take on traditional female roles. I think my argument is some of the early manifestations of her interests I've discovered show the traditional side of her ambivalence. Not so much this one, though. It's the woman in a domestic role. I think the fact that she's got her kids in a box hints at some dissatisfaction with that domesticity. This too, I mean, the woman has a bow and arrow, so she's kind of empowered, but she's shooting at a target that says dirt. And so she's dirt killer. That's what it says on her hat. But also she's wearing the type of constricting garment, which is exactly what progressive women, including Charlotte Perkins Gilman, are going to protest against in the years of first generation feminism. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is going to talk about fashion and how this kind of garment is just not appropriate for women or not helpful for women. But other cards like this show the woman in a traditional domestic role. The boy, this is all Soapine is the name of the soap. The boy climbs for the stars. The woman has a man guide her to the stars. To me, these gender dichotomies, partially these are advertisements, so she's trying to please the public, but I think they reflect the more traditional side of her personality before she got liberated. And one of the reasons she decided it would be a good idea to marry Charles Walter Stetson. This is a classic one. You know, the woman is inside, the men come from the outdoors. That domestic outside world division that we see in one of her fairly rare finished watercolors that's in the Schlesinger Library here, which I think is a symbolic self-portrait of her or an alter ego looking yearningly over a wall at freedom on the other side. I think it descends from a great 19th century tradition, Caspar David Friedrich's Woman at the Window, and Perkins and Stetson were extremely erudite about 19th century European art. And this is a Stetson in grief, which I think reflects her and her postpartum depression. So I'm doing a kind of biographical interpretation of their work at the time. Another thing that got me into this is that Stetson, well, she left after that unsuccessful cure and moved with her to her friends, to the care of her friend Grace Channing, who would become Stetson's second wife in Pasadena. And a year later, he followed her there. But the Whiteheads were bi-coastal. They had a mansion in Montecito, California, as well as Birdcliff. And in the winters, they go to Montecito. And Whitehead commissioned Stetson to do decorative paintings for Arcady. This is a photograph of part of it, their estate in Montecito, which I went and tried to find, and I couldn't find them. So I think they've probably been painted over or destroyed. But the Stetson connection to Birdcliff goes on. And so does Charlotte Perkins Gilman, because she was a regular visitor to Birdcliff in her later years. So what really ignited my interest in all this is this book, because I was researching for the centennial exhibition of the Birdcliff Art Colony. And I was interested in the Stetson's connection, and just researching, I found this book written by Mrs. Charles Walter Stetson. This is a book that now is known to the many fanatical Charlotte Perkins Gilman scholars, but then wasn't, because it wasn't under her name. Just the name is an example of her traditionalism at the time of her marriage. So I was able to get a copy. And it's a fascinating book. And also, she never mentions it again in her prolific later writings, even her autobiographical writings. She never mentions Art Gems for the Home and Fireside, which is an art book of reproductions, prints after 19th century academic paintings, and her commentary. She wrote the commentary. And in my reading of this, I'll give you a couple of examples. I found that her commentary is also extremely traditionalist and totally unliberated, with a few exceptions. So in the centerfold is the reproduction of Leonardo's Last Supper. After that, there are about 90 prints after paintings by artists who only experts in 19th century European academic art have ever heard of. Almost nobody famous in this, except for, like I say, if you're a scholar, you might know it. But then there are prints after paintings like this by Walter Langley, British artist. But Men Must Work and Women Must Weep, with her commentary. These are the wife and, no, I guess the mother and the daughter is the wife of a sailor, and the sailor is out at sea, and the women are indoors in their domestic setting, mourning probably the loss of the adventuring husband. I just picked a couple of these. I've got there are a lot of these that have commentary that is surprisingly unliberated by Charlotte Perkins Stetson at the time. This is called In the Library. It's after an engraving by Brennamore. Here's some of her commentary. Her commentary runs a full page, usually, or a good part of a page. But anyhow, it's an attractive young woman in the library. She writes, "It may be surmised that the young lady so pleasingly represented as scarcely a literary person. There is surely a strong suggestion that she is here solely because her complexion seems clearest against the old vellum and calfskin bindings, and her brocade dress more dainty and fresh behind the old oak furniture. And maybe she came to see Papa a moment, and Papa having left, she idly turned the leaves to see what books were like, what his books were like. At any rate, she is not the habitué of this library. A man makes this his den, a man who does work and reads the Times, as we may see by looking at the paper on the table. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman would become a critic of gendered architecture, the woman's realm versus the man's realm, but she's certainly not there yet with commentary like that. I have one more. Like I said, I could have picked a dozen of these illustrations where her commentary was kind of startlingly unfeminist. This is The Christening by, again, a little known 19th century painting, W. Frederick Kammerer. I'm not going to read you the whole thing by any means, but but what we have here is a family leaving a church after the baby is christened, where this is the mother and this is the nursemaid. So right away, that's a opening for gender critique, which we don't get. What she writes is the sturdy peasant element mingles well with the feeble offshoot of nobility. And she wonders about the godfather on the left. Is the little morsel of muslin draped humanity he is eyeing so earnestly, or the audaciously pretty nurse? So she turns into this flirtatious thing. Again, totally unfeminist. So that's just a couple of examples. She would then write the yellow wallpaper a few years after her divorce from Stetson. She would start her own magazine called The Forerunner. She would write Women in Economics, published in 1898, gave Ralph Whitehead a copy, which is a groundbreaking argument that domestic woman's labor is as important as man's labor in the factory or the office and should be given equivalent respect. An argument still with us today that she was one of the pioneers of. Anyhow, this is The Forerunner with her image of a nuclear family on the cover, based on a drawing by her daughter, who by now was a young aspiring artist herself, where we have the nuclear family nude and the baby a male, and then it gets transformed to being clothed and a female baby for the cover of the Forerunner magazine. So Charles Walter Stetson, by the way, I've gotten more and more interested in, and I think he's really interesting in terms, again, of sexuality and sexual mores in the late Victorian and early modern period. Also from a poor family with a father who was a reverend. Both Gilman and Stetson's parents were men of the cloth. Gilman's father was a minister and Stetson's father was a reverend, and both were economically not well off. But Stetson struggled to be an artist, and one of his complaints is that it was so hard to get models. The model issue again. He didn't have money to hire them. He would buy photographs, import photographs from London of nude models because they were hard to get in the United States. And he did produce a lot of paintings that are conservative but interesting. They're not that conservative because they're painterly, but these are kind of fantasy figures in a lush landscape. He did some beautiful still lifes. He was active in Rhode Island at first, and that's where he met Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Both were from Rhode Island families, and that's where their marriage took place. Some of you might know this building of the Arts Club in Providence. It's down the hill from Brown University and up the hill from RISD. This was created by Stetson and his artist friends and decorated by them, and it's still on the street in good shape. He did the allegorical figures of the arts at the top, among other things, where he's investing in traditional images of women as idealized allegories. This is architecture. It's painting, sculpture, and architecture. She's holding a little building as the emblem of architecture. But he was also really interested in the female nude and did a lot of paintings of female nudes, as I'll be showing you. This is one that I think is a good example of his style and also the sensuosity of his artistic interests. I think it's a comment on the famous Ang, the source, but instead of Ang's well-known crystal clear, crisp, hard-edged drawing quality, he incorporates the painterliness of Ingres' arch rival, the romantic painter Delacroix. This is, I don't know if this has ever been reproduced. This is a illustrated calendar he made for Charlotte Perkins Gilman before she left him as a kind of expression of love, which has, again, images of nudity, something that has not been published about him is that he gave a lecture in 1886 in Providence about nudity. Let's see if the artist of the nobler sort in sympathy with the creator penetrates by his aesthetic faculty the accretions of lustful time, sees that in essence man is beautiful and good, and labors to eliminate the acquired and grosser qualities and present him as the image of God. So this lecture he gave was about God created man and woman to look as they are, and that should be treated with respect and reverence and not turned into something obscene. And he actually advocated in this lecture that children be exposed to images of ideal nudes so they get used to it because it's reality, so the child will be refined and ennobled, which will make obscenity and sin ugly to him. So he had this idealized view of the nude, but I also think it parallels in a conservative way what Freud is writing about at the same time, to talk about sexuality, to expose it, which is healthier than to repress it. This is also from the calendar, which she wrote, she really appreciated, really lovely, but within a few months she had gone to Pasadena, where he followed her. As I'll show you in the last few minutes. These are some of his paintings set back in ancient times, but with a lot of lush landscape and erotic imagery, bacchanals. This is another side of his painting where he does these kind of anonymous religious scenes. This isn't the biblical subject. It just looks kind of biblical, but set in ancient times. And this is a painting that was recently brought to my attention, which is called Worship of the Phallus, a small painting by Charles Walter Stetson, which is pretty radical for the early 20th century for a traditionalist artist. So he's kind of embracing sexuality. And part of this was getting models to model nude, that perpetual struggle, which he managed to do in Pasadena, where he did this series. He got a camera, and these again are little known and rarely, if ever, shown. He got a camera and somehow got these two young women to joyfully pose for him in his backyard in Pasadena and take pictures of them. I picked this to begin with because he calls it a Bacchic dance. So again, he's relating it to Greco-Roman antiquity to give it a kind of legitimacy, but they seem to be having a good time. And this one is directly the source for a painting of his called the May Dance from 1882, which date I question because I think that he wasn't in Pasadena yet. But so this takes some further research, but obviously the photograph is the source for the painting, which is again set in some idealized classical past. Another, I think, fascinating aspect of his body of work are these photographs in the Archives of American Art, where he got nude models and photographed them, apparently with a proviso that their faces be hidden. And this is, again, an indication of the morality and the strictures of sexuality at the time. There's a bunch of these. Some have the face exposed, but quite a few are like this. This one has the face torn off, which brings me to what I think is kind of a remarkable document at the Schlesinger Library, which is his diary, where somebody went through it and crossed out the parts they don't like, like a visual emblem of censorship. And I wonder if digital technology with scanning could actually separate the text out underneath. But I just thought of that the other day. This is this famous drawing by Thomas Eakins of a similar subject. Thomas Eakins, one of the greatest 19th century American artists, who lost his teaching job because of exposing his co-eds to nude models. And I'm gonna, well, this is a Eva Watson Schutze, which is okay because it's innocent. It's two young children. This is a more radical Eva Watson Schutze, really exceptional photograph of a nude man. We haven't seen one of those yet in my presentation by a woman. And this is a photograph of her husband, which I think relates again to the sexual mores of the time. This is a photograph of the great Thomas Eakins, and I think it's probably by his wife, Jane McDowell, because I think the few times we get images of nude men by women photographers, I think it's enabled by the fact that they're married, which makes it more legitimate. And this brings us back to Doing Word, who's working with similar issues of the nude with co-ed classes and the nude outdoors, where this important painting in the Arthur Anderson collection, you'll notice she doesn't reveal the face. The face isn't masked, but it's certainly far from a portrait. It's abstracted. So with that, I'll conclude with this. Moving into the next generation, this is a rubble painting by Lucille Blanche, Woodstock artist, that was just recently given to the Woodstock Artists Association Museum Permanent Collection. And I have my own interpretation of this. It was given by a Woodstock family with no background, but I think it's still Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Lucille Blanche, 1927. Charlotte Perkins Gilman published a novel in the Forerunner called Herland, which was of a utopian country of only women who reproduced through parthenogenesis. They didn't need men to have babies, and they lived productive and happy lives in this idyllic country. So I suspect, with Charlotte Perkins Gilman being such a strong presence in Woodstock, that Lucille Blanche read the novel and was inspired to illustrate it in this large and fascinating painting. So with that, I will conclude.
Thank you.
I hope.
Thank you, Tom. Just to see if I can stimulate a little conversation. After many years that I spent in the Soho art community before ever arriving up here in Woodstock, gentrification became the greatest curse of what was a very vibrant art community, visual arts community in particular. What would either one of you or both of you have to say that you would like to see manifested in or around Woodstock to enhance its visual arts heritage and or, to protect a possibility of a future for both creating art and, preserving it?
Arthur here. I'll think about that for sure. I don't have anything to say because I'm really overwhelmed by Tom's brilliant presentation and research. This is all new work as far as I'm concerned. And I say bravo to Tom. It's great, Tom. Thank you.
Sure.
Now I'm going to think about what you just asked, Doug.
Okay. Tom, do you have a feeling about that? You must have.
Well, I think of myself as someone who one of his characteristics, he sees both sides of many questions, which is not always a way to make yourself lovable. But I think Woodstock has benefited a fair amount from gentrification in that there is growing support for some of the nonprofit art institutions that are there.
Mhm.
And if you know Birdcliff, Ralph Whitehead created about 30 arts and crafts buildings there. It's an amazing place, and I recommend you visit it because over 25 of them are still there intact, but they were inherited by the Woodstock Birdcliff, which is a nonprofit art organization which is tasked with maintaining and supporting these 25 buildings, and that's a big burden.
The challenge I'm talking about is that of, enhancing, making it possible for artists who may not be of major means to be able to be in the area from, into the future and be able to create art locally. I guess that's my.
I see more and more artists moving to the Catskills, partially in reaction to COVID.
Right, that happened.
Yeah. And maybe it's more affordable than probably it's more affordable than the city.
That's almost any place.
Yeah.
May I ask a question regarding the, by the way, thank you for the presentation tonight. So much information. Can you talk a little bit more about the collection? Because I'm located now in St. Petersburg, Florida. And you mentioned the museum has a large collection of the Birdcliff arts and crafts in the museum. How did you say how that came to be? Did you mention how that came to be?
I didn't say, but this rich guy who I read got wealthy in pharmaceuticals. I don't know if this, I'm not sure. Somebody came up with another reason the other day, but anyhow, he's very wealthy and he started collecting American arts and crafts, and he just um kept collecting, and he was able to outbid anybody for important pieces of Birdcliff furniture. And he built a big modern building in St. Petersburg. It's not just Birdcliff, it's Gustav Stickley and Roycroft. I mean, look it up online. You know, I get their newsletter every month.
Well, I'm like a few miles from it. It's one of the places I haven't had a chance to go to, but everybody raves about it, and I just wondered how it came to be. Guess I can do some research, but I was kind of fascinated that the tie, there's always like these weird ties, and suddenly you're thinking, well, I live right near that thing.
Well, this guy, Rudy Ciccarelli, I think is his last name, is a very talented collector and really knew how to assemble a major collection, totally focused on American arts and crafts. Well, there's some British things there too. It's kind of the source, but it's vast collection of American arts and crafts. And they do rotating exhibitions and have the permanent collection on view too, up to George Nakashima, who they consider the great Japanese furniture designer, who they consider kind of the heir of that legacy of truth to materials and using natural materials.
Right. Does anyone else in the audience have a question for these two gentlemen? They're stunned by your brilliance, apparently.
Well, what do you think about the gentrification of Woodstock?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, of course it's inevitable, and the efforts were made in Soho and the surrounding communities to try to protect them for artisan residents, through screening people that were trying to get into lofts legally. And that was very effective for a number of decades. Ultimately, when those original artists started dying off, their children started saying, well, if I can sell this $1 million that my mother or father bought for 30,000, why not do that? That changed the whole complexion of Soho. In the Hudson Valley, I would agree with you that many artists have moved up here, and that's fantastic. They can't all afford to be in Woodstock, however, but in many of the surrounding areas, we have continuing to arrive all the time, artists from the city and elsewhere, and that's very encouraging.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I am the current Chamber of Commerce co-president here in Woodstock, New York. Thank you for this presentation and also for that question. It's an important one that we're all asking here as our local artists, some of them first, second, and third generation artists here are not able to live here either. And there is a general sort of, hey, people are moving up and they're bringing money and it's great. And in actuality, it's really causing our community to suffer because the actual regenerative capacity is waning. As you said, some of these places and communities all around the world, people are sort of saying, hey, we could just sell this for a lot more money and let it go. And just watching this presentation and seeing some of this art and knowing, being raised by women here in Woodstock all through the 70s and 80s, as a child, this is a really important question for all of us because revivals and renaissances, somehow we hope that they actually include those of us who were born and raised in this community, and that money doesn't actually end up consuming all of our art and ending up in museums far off and collections. So I'm really happy that you're sharing this with us now, and feel fortunate to have gotten to see some of these pieces.
Mhm. Any other comments? If not, I would like to thank very much both Arthur Anderson and
I have
Tom.
a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So can I see that collection? I can go see it. It's wonderful.
At the State Museum in Albany.
Yeah.
The answer is yes, yes, but get the book.
Mhm.
That's one introduction. Also, if you have an interest in seeing something specific there or a specific artist, I can't speak for them, but I would say ask Karen Quinn, who's on this call now, who's one of the senior curators. There have been two exhibitions, one at the New York State Museum from the end of 2018 to all of 2019. And then, as was said, it then moved for the first half of 23 to Dorsey Museum at New Paltz. I have doubts that the New York State Museum has some plans for doing other uses of the collection. And if you perchance are a teacher from K to 12, they have done a series of wonderful lesson plans based on the collection. And for those, you just go to their website and they're available to you. But they're very open about talking and making or meeting community needs. And one of my important reasons for selecting them for the collection was, one, it would be featured because the New York State Museum is all about art and artists and objects, right, and culture of New York State, not Connecticut, not New Jersey, New York State. So that's the mission. And they're not an art museum per se. That was important to me. They're a museum of the state of New York, whatever that involves. It could be indigenous culture, it could be many other, could be, 9/11 objects that have been saved from there, from that disaster. It's just a very broadly based museum. Also minerals that is based on anything that has to do with New York State.
Right.
So look at their website. They're part of the state education department. They're not a standalone, relying on public funding museum.
Did you say Karen Quinn and she's here? So
Yes,
you recommend contacting her?
I recommend going to the website, seeing what they have, so you know.
Okay.
Yeah,
You know what's there, you're informed. But she's a very gracious person, and she was the author of the book we were just talking about that is being published by SUNY Press,
right.
the Historic Woodstock Art County.
So again, thank you, Arthur Anderson. Thank you, Tom Wolf. Thank you, Miriam Deutsch, our programming director. Thank you, audience members. And we see you next week. And if you're going to be in the city on May 20th, come to our gala. Look it up at www.atoanyc.org. And good night.
Good night. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's
Thank you.
fascinating.